I had never imagined that a single whispered sentence could carve itself so sharply into the marrow of my bones that even the air around me seemed to stop moving. It happened in a place where people usually cling to the ones they love with both hands, where desperation strips away pride, where no one pretends to be stronger than they are. The hospital's automatic doors slid shut behind us, sealing in the sterile brightness, the faint scent of antiseptic, and the quiet murmur of nurses moving from one emergency to the next. My son leaned heavily against me, his face pale, his breath uneven, his arm trembling as I wrapped my hand around his elbow to steady him. I thought in that moment he would let me guide him to the reception desk, let me speak for him the way I used to when he was small and feverish and frightened. I thought pain might loosen whatever distance had grown between us over the years. But instead he pulled slightly away, bent his head toward mine, and whispered something that hollowed me out so quickly that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "Do not tell them you are my mother." The words were soft but sharp, barely louder than the hum of overhead lights, but they pierced in a way that set my entire body trembling. I felt the warmth of his breath on my cheek, felt the tremor in his voice, and yet all I could hear were the syllables that separated me from him in one swift motion. I blinked hard, trying to understand why he would say such a thing, why he would choose this moment to detach himself from me, why he would reduce me to a stranger standing beside him in a place where family should have been a shield. He straightened slightly, wiped sweat from his forehead, and looked around the emergency waiting area with that same anxious flicker in his eyes I had begun seeing more and more lately. A flicker that always appeared when he feared someone might see us together too closely. He was 32 years old and handsome in a way that made strangers smile at him. He had a good job, dressed in pressed shirts and polished shoes, spoke in a voice that carried confidence and charm. He lived in a world that worshipped appearances, where he always tried to stand taller, walk faster, shine brighter. And I did not belong to that world. I wore a faded sweater with loose threads, carried an old purse with worn leather handles, and walked with the careful steps of a woman who had worked on her feet most of her life. My hands bore the map of every job I ever took to keep him fed. My face wore the gentle softness of age rather than the polished glow of wealth. I knew this. I lived with it peacefully. But I never expected him to see it as something shameful. He kept glancing toward a group of young professionals gathered near the water dispenser, their suits crisp, their hair styled neatly, their conversations sprinkled with light humor even in the hospital's tense air. They worked with him. I recognized two of them from a photograph he had shown me once when he was proud of his promotion. They were laughing softly, unaware of us, unaware of the silent hurricane unraveling between my son and me. When he whispered those words, I felt something inside me dip downward like a stone sinking into a deep well. I tried to speak, but the breath caught in my throat. Instead, I simply steadied him as he approached the reception desk, my heart thrumming painfully behind my ribs. He spoke to the nurse in a tone that tried to hide the strain in his voice. He gave his name, answered her questions quickly, and when she turned to me with gentle eyes and asked if I was his mother, something inside me clenched so tightly that for a moment I felt dizzy. I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "I am just here with him." The sentence tasted wrong on my tongue, like something broken, something I should never have been asked to say. The nurse nodded and wrote something on her clipboard. My son exhaled with visible relief, unaware of the way my stomach twisted, unaware of the tears burning behind my eyelids, unaware of the weight of the moment he had asked me to carry. He did not see me, not the real me. Not the mother who had stitched together every loose thread of his childhood. Not the woman who had worked double shifts just to make sure he had school supplies. Not the woman who had walked to bus stops in the rain to make sure he was never alone. He saw only what he feared others would see. A woman who did not fit into the glossy world he tried so hard to belong to. We took seats near the far wall, where sharp fluorescent lights cast pale shapes across the floor. He pressed a hand to his chest, wincing as the pain tightened again. I wanted to reach for him, to hold his hand, to let him lean into me the way he always did as a boy, but I kept my palms flat against my lap. I did not want to embarrass him. I had done enough already simply by existing in his presence, or at least that was what his whisper had made me feel. He slumped forward slightly, breathing through clenched teeth, and for a moment my instinct overpowered my hurt. I reached out and touched his shoulder gently. His head lifted just enough for him to look at me, and the fear in his eyes softened my anger even as the shame lingered. He looked like a little boy again, frightened and hurting and unsure of how to carry himself through pain. But just as my heart softened, one of his coworkers walked through the waiting area, and I watched everything change in him. His spine straightened, his expression tightened. His hand quickly brushed mine away. He cleared his throat, forcing a neutral expression. I watched him pretend he was alone, watched him mask any sign that he had come here with someone who did not fit the picture he wanted the world to see. The coworker walked past with a polite nod, unaware of the emotional destruction unfolding in the space between us. My son exhaled as if relieved. And I sat there, hands trembling slightly, realizing that the hospital's bright lights were reflecting more than his pain. They were reflecting a truth I had tried to ignore for years. He had outgrown me. No, not outgrown, outdistanced. Drifted so far into a world fueled by insecurity and image that I had become something fragile and inconvenient. An echo of a past he was trying to outrun. Before I could process the ache settling in my chest, a nurse appeared and called his name. He stood, steadied himself, and looked back at me with a hesitation that carried a hint of guilt. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then shut it again. His hand twitched at his side as though he wanted to reach for mine but feared being seen. "Come with me," he said quietly. And for a moment, hope flickered. But then he added, quickly, urgently, "Just do not say anything unnecessary." I followed him down the hallway, the sound of our footsteps echoing against white walls, and with each step, the distance between us seemed to stretch further even though we were only inches apart. He walked ahead with long strides, and I trailed behind like a shadow he was trying not to acknowledge. When we reached the exam room, he lowered himself onto the bed with a heavy exhale. I took a seat in the corner, folding my hands in my lap, shrinking into the smallest version of myself so I would not embarrass him further. Minutes passed. A doctor entered, his voice calm and reassuring. He examined my son, asked him a series of questions about the sharp pain in his chest, the shortness of breath, the dizziness. My son answered quickly, carefully, aware of the image he wanted to maintain. But at one point, the doctor turned to me and asked gently if I had noticed any other symptoms. My son froze. His eyes shot toward me, sharp with warning, and I lied. "No," I said softly, "I am just here." The truth tasted as bitter as betrayal. The doctor nodded and continued, unaware of the silent war unfolding in the room. When he finished the initial exam, he stepped back, scribbled notes, and then asked the question that would pull the entire illusion apart. "I need someone to sign these forms. Who is his next of kin?" My son's face went still, his breath stopped, his eyes widened, and in that instant the shame that had kept him hiding me shattered, because there was no one else. No wife, no partner, no friend close enough, no sibling. No one who had stood by him longer or more fiercely than I had. He looked at me, really looked at me, and something old and familiar flickered in his expression, something that broke the mask he had been wearing since the moment we walked through those doors. He whispered one word, "Mom," and everything inside me cracked open. The word hung in the air between us with a weight that felt almost physical, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to catch it before it fell. "Mom," a single syllable. When he had spoken thousands of times before without thought, without hesitation, without shame. But here, in this room filled with sterile light and the soft beeping of machines, it felt different. It felt like something he had tried to bury had clawed its way back to the surface. Tearing through the fragile layers of pride and image he had wrapped around himself like fragile armor. He stared at me with an expression I had not seen in years, an expression that cracked open something deep inside him. Not anger, not fear, not even embarrassment. It was something rawer, something closer to the truth he had been denying even to himself. The doctor looked between us, waiting for clarification, unaware of the silent war that had been waged in the shadows of our relationship for years. My son swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply as he forced the words out with a voice that trembled on the edges. "She is my mother." His confession came with a kind of quiet violence that made my breath catch. Not a violence aimed at me, but at the version of himself he had sculpted so carefully over time, the version that had no room for the woman who raised him in a small home with peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture. The version that wanted to step into polished spaces without the reminder of the life he had come from. But now, with the doctor waiting, with pain tightening his chest, with his mask slipping, He could not run from the truth anymore. The doctor nodded, relieved to have an answer that made sense, and handed me the clipboard with the forms. His tone was clinical, gentle in the way medical professionals are trained to be, unaware of the emotional earthquake he had triggered simply by asking a routine question. I took the clipboard with steady hands, though inside me something was trembling violently. I read the lines carefully, my eyes tracing the words as if signing them would tether us together again in a way we had not been connected in years. Next of kin, emergency contact. Legal guardian in medical crisis. Roles I had always held without question when he was young. Roles that had faded as he pulled away, as he climbed higher in a world that valued veneers over roots, polish over honesty. He watched me sign with an expression that seemed to shift in real time, the small muscles around his eyes tightening, the corners of his mouth twitching, the shame on his face replaced gradually by something else. Something quieter, something that struck me with unexpected force. Regret. For the whisper in the lobby, for the years of distance, for the moments he had pretended not to see me. When I returned the clipboard to the doctor, he offered a small, reassuring smile and left the room, promising to run tests and return shortly. The door clicked shut softly behind him, leaving the room wrapped in a silence that pressed against my skin like warm breath. My son lowered himself back onto the bed, wincing as the pain tightened once more. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to hold his hand the way I used to when he was 8 years old and afraid of hospitals. I wanted to do every small gesture mothers never stop wanting to offer, even when their children grow too tall to accept them. But I waited. I waited because I did not want to be the one who forced closeness where he had built walls. I waited because I wanted whatever came next to come from him, not from my longing. He stared at the ceiling for several seconds, his breathing uneven, his chest rising shallowly with each inhale. I could see his mind working in the same tense rhythm as his pulse. Finally, he spoke. I did not want them to see you. The words sliced quietly through the room, not cruelly, not harshly, but with a devastating honesty he could no longer hide. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling as he continued, as if he couldn't bear to see my reaction. He said that his coworkers were young and polished, and came from families who hosted dinner parties with linen napkins and matching dinner sets. He said they never knew struggle or scarcity, or the way broken appliances stayed broken for months because money had to go to rent or food instead. He said they talked about their parents with ease, describing their comfortable homes and perfect marriages and yearly vacations. He said he wanted to fit in with them. He wanted to feel equal. He wanted to feel like he belonged somewhere that did not remind him of everything he had lacked. And seeing me, he said, broke the illusion. I stayed quiet. Not because I had no words, but because sometimes silence can say more than an argument. Sometimes silence carries the weight of truth more sharply than any spoken sentence. He turned his head slightly toward me, his face pale, his eyes tired but clearer now that the mask had cracked. He said he knew it was wrong. He said he knew he should not have cared. He said he hated himself for feeling this way. Each confession dropped from his lips like stones falling into water, rippling outward, stirring the depth of everything between us. I studied him as he spoke, his trembling hands, his furrowed brow, the shame pulling at his expression like invisible strings, and I realized something I had suspected for years but had never fully understood until now. His shame was not born from me. It was born from the world he had chosen to inhabit, a world that rewarded polish over authenticity, a world that pushed him into roles of confidence and wealth while burying the truth of who he was and where he came from. A world that judged him not on merit but on appearances, and in that world loyalty to one's roots could feel like weakness. Yet the irony was sharp, because it was those roots that had carried him here. It was me who had held him through every storm. It was my sacrifices that paved the road he now walked. It was my hands that fed him, clothed him, guided him, protected him. And somehow, he had learned to see those same hands as something out of place. He exhaled sharply, blinking rapidly as if trying to stop tears he did not want to show. He whispered again that he was sorry. This time the apology did not sound like a reflex. It sounded like a truth. His voice cracked, and the crack was what finally made him look at me. Really look, not through the lens of shame or worry or fear of being judged, but through the lens of a son who had forgotten the shape of a mother's love and had suddenly remembered it all at once. Before I could speak, He clutched the sheets tightly and said something that pulled the breath from my lungs. I did not want them to see you because I did not want them to see how much I failed you. I stared at him, stunned. Failed me. The word echoed in my mind with a strange ache. He said he felt guilty that he had climbed so high and left me behind. He said he felt ashamed of how little time he gave me. He said each time he visited, the house I still lived in reminded him of the years he had escaped, but I had endured. He said he could not bear the idea of his colleagues seeing the life I still lived, a life he had worked so hard to climb away from. And suddenly, I understood with painful clarity. He had not hidden me because he was ashamed of me. He had hidden me because he was ashamed of himself. He believed that his success had come at the cost of leaving me behind. He believed that his new world required him to sever the old one. He believed that I was a reminder of everything he wished his past had not been. I felt a deep sadness settle inside me, but it was not anger. It was something gentler, something that wrapped around the ache rather than sharpened it. I stood and walked slowly to the side of the bed, my steps soft, my hands shaking slightly. I placed one hand gently on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, not in rejection but in emotional overload. His breath caught in his throat. I told him quietly that he had never failed me. I told him that every sacrifice I made because I wanted him to have a life beyond the edges of mine. I told him that it did not hurt me that he outgrew the world we came from. What hurt was believing he had to erase me to enter his new one. He shut his eyes tightly, and for the first time since he was a teenager, I saw tears slip from beneath his lashes. Real tears, tears he didn't hide, tears he didn't swallow. Tears that carried the weight of years of silent guilt. He whispered that he did not know how to fix things, that he did not know how to stand between both worlds without feeling split in two, that he did not know how to show up for me without feeling like he was failing in his new life. I squeezed his shoulder gently. You do not need to fix anything, I said softly. You only need to stop running from where you come from. He opened his eyes slowly and looked at me with an expression so raw it made me feel 14 years younger. The doctor returned then, but neither of us moved. The doctor spoke about tests and possible causes and monitoring the heart, but all I felt was the way my son's hand slowly, hesitantly reached for mine. Not to pretend, not out of necessity, not because anyone was watching, but because he finally remembered he needed me. The doctor's voice blended into the background, a calm stream of medical language that floated above us without fully landing, because the moment between my son and me had pulled everything else out of focus. I heard words like arrhythmia and inflammation and precaution, but they felt distant, muffled, softened by the weight of what had just broken open inside the room. My son's hand trembled where it rested against mine. His grip was weak, but there was something desperate in the way his fingers curled slightly toward my palm, as if he was testing whether I would pull away the way he had done to me earlier in the waiting room. I didn't move. I let him hold on to me with the frail courage of someone who has forgotten what comfort feels like and is relearning it in painful, halting breaths. The doctor finished explaining the preliminary concerns and said he would return with test results shortly. When the door clicked shut, the room sank into a quiet so thick it felt as if the walls themselves were listening. My son leaned his head back against the pillow, his eyes half closed, his breath uneven from more than just the chest pain. I could see the war inside him, settling and resurfacing in waves, guilt and fear, and exhaustion sliding across his expression in uncontrollable shifts. I stayed still beside him, not speaking, not pushing, letting the air settle in the space between us like a fragile bridge waiting to see if it could hold our weight. After a while, his voice came out in a low, rough whisper. Do you think they saw? He didn't have to explain who they were. I knew. Those polished coworkers with their designer watches, their effortless smiles, their easy confidence that came from never having tasted scarcity. The same coworkers he had avoided letting see me, as if my very presence could tarnish the image he had been shaping so carefully. The question made my chest ache, not because of the shame buried inside it, but because of the vulnerability threaded through his voice, a vulnerability he had tried so hard for so long to hide. He spoke with the tone of a man who spent years pretending he wasn't shaped by the smallness of his childhood home, a man who wanted to look untouchable, but was now cracked open in front of the only person who had seen every version of him. I looked at him quietly, studying the tension in his jaw, the worry pulling at his eyebrows, the fragility in the way he stared at the ceiling as if answers might appear there. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice soft but steady. Does it matter? He swallowed hard, and for a brief second he looked like a boy again, sitting at the dining table with a broken pencil in his hand, frustrated because he couldn't complete his homework, too proud to ask for help even though he needed it. Back then, I had placed my hand on his shoulder and told him he didn't have to do everything alone. And yet, somewhere along the line, adulthood had convinced him that needing me was a weakness rather than a thread of belonging. He turned his head toward me slowly, pain etched deeply across his features. "It matters to me," he whispered, and those words landed heavily between us. Not because they were selfish, but because they revealed the truth he had been hiding. He wasn't ashamed of me. He was ashamed of how he believed others would interpret me. He feared their judgment more than he trusted his own roots. He feared being seen as the man who came from a woman who worked long shifts and wore thrift store sweaters and counted every dollar to make ends meet. He feared the parts of his history that didn't shine. And in fearing them, he feared me too. I didn't respond immediately. I let his words settle in the space between us, the way dust settles after something fragile shatters on the floor. After a moment, he closed his eyes and exhaled with a tremor that carried the weight of years. "I wish I could be proud of where I came from," he murmured. "But every time I get close to admitting it, something in me twists and I feel like I am drowning." At the office, everyone has stories about trips abroad, second homes, private schools. And when they ask about my childhood, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to explain a life nobody else understands. His voice cracked on the last word, a small crack that revealed a canyon beneath it. I felt something inside me respond, a mixture of sorrow and understanding, and an ache so old it felt like it had been sleeping inside me for years. I remembered the nights when I would come home late from work, exhausted, my feet aching, my fingers numb from washing dishes for hours. I remembered watching him sleep, curled up under thin blankets, unaware of how hard I was trying to shield him from the hardness of our life. I remembered thinking that if I worked hard enough, he would never have to feel the sting of shame. I didn't realize that in giving him a better future, the world around him would teach him to be ashamed of the very past I had fought so hard to survive. I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, something I hadn't done in years. He didn't flinch this time. He exhaled slowly, his face softening under my touch. I told him quietly that every sacrifice I made was born from love, not from shame. I told him that every choice I took, every job I held, every night I came home worn out, was to give him a life where he wouldn't have to endure what I did. I told him I had never asked him to advertise where he came from, but I had hoped he would never feel the need to erase it, or erase me. He opened his eyes again, and there was something different in them now, something rawer, something closer to an apology he didn't yet know how to form. But instead of speaking, he sat up slowly, clutching his chest, wincing at the pain. I helped steady him, and for the first time in years, he did not pull away. He looked at me with eyes full of something heavier than shame. Fear, not fear of me. Fear of losing me. He whispered that when the pain first struck earlier that morning, when he felt his heart tighten and his breath shorten, he realized something he had been avoiding for years. He realized that in all his efforts to rise in the world, he had distanced himself from the only person who had ever truly cared for him. He realized that none of the people he tried so hard to impress would have come to the hospital with him. Not one coworker, not one friend from his new social circle, not one person whose approval he chased like it was the air he needed to breathe. But I had come, without question, without hesitation, without asking who else might see. He lifted a shaking hand and covered his face, his voice muffled and uneven. "I thought there would be time to fix things. I thought I could figure out how to balance everything later. I thought I could come back to you when I was ready. But today made me realize something might happen, and you would not even know you were still the most important person in my life." I felt my heart twist in painful understanding. I took his hand gently and held it with both of mine. He didn't pull away. He didn't hide. He didn't look around to see who was watching. For the first time in years, he let himself be my son again. When the door opened and the doctor returned with results, we both turned toward him, still holding hands. The doctor walked in with a folder and sat down with the calm professionalism of someone used to delivering difficult truths. But even before he spoke, I felt the room shift slightly, felt the air tighten, felt something settle heavy in the moment. My son's grip tightened on my hand. The doctor looked at him with steady eyes and said something that would change everything. "We found something in your tests that needs immediate attention." My son inhaled sharply, and I held on to him even tighter, because this time he wasn't facing it alone. The doctor's voice did not rise or tremble when he spoke, but the calmness in his tone somehow made the words feel heavier, as if every syllable were carefully balanced to keep us from falling apart too quickly. He said they had found signs of inflammation and irregular rhythm, something that could be managed but not ignored. He explained that sudden stress, exhaustion, strain, and long-term pressure could aggravate it. He mentioned the possibility of further tests, monitoring, medication, maybe lifestyle changes. His voice was steady, precise, almost gentle, but all I heard was the unspoken truth echoing beneath his words. My son was not invincible. For years, he had been building himself into someone he believed had to be unbreakable. Someone who walked with straight shoulders and a smooth voice and an aura of success so bright it blinded him to his own limits. Someone who worked longer hours than anyone else, skipped meals, stayed up nights chasing deadlines, polishing his public image until it gleamed like glass. Someone who refused to let anyone see him tired, weak, struggling, stressed. Someone afraid to rest because rest felt like failure. Someone who carried his childhood poverty like a shadow he was terrified would fall over him again if he slowed down even for a moment. And now his own body had cracked under the pressure. I watched him take in the doctor's words with a stillness that frightened me. His jaw clenched. His fingers dug into his knees. His eyes didn't blink for several long seconds. I could see him trying to maintain the polished exterior he wore at work, struggling to keep his face unreadable even as the truth pressed against him like a weight he could no longer lift. The doctor continued explaining things in careful phrases, offering reassurance but also unmistakable warning. My son nodded along mechanically, answering questions with short, tight responses that sounded more like rehearsed politeness than genuine understanding. But then the doctor stepped back, folded his hands gently, and asked a question that unraveled all the composure my son had been clinging to. "Do you have someone who can support you with this?" My son inhaled sharply, and for the briefest moment his eyes flicked toward the door, as if imagining a room full of coworkers who would never step inside. He imagined friends who only met him in loud bars and polished spaces, people who knew his achievements but not his heart. He imagined the world he had built around himself, a world that glittered on the surface but offered nothing solid when he needed something to hold. And then his eyes drifted to me. This time he did not look away. I felt his gaze land on me with a weight that made my breath catch. His expression shifted slowly, something fragile breaking open inside it, something he had spent years hiding behind the walls of ambition and pride. For a moment the room fell quiet, the machines humming softly, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above us, the doctor waiting patiently for his response. My son parted his lips as if to speak, but no words came out. His throat tightened visibly. The doctor's question had pierced him in a way neither of us expected. It wasn't about medical responsibility. It was about connection, about trust. About who stands beside you when the world stops spinning smoothly. He lowered his eyes, his voice barely audible. "I have my mother." The simplicity of the sentence struck me with a force I could not hide from. Not because he said it aloud, but because of the way he said it, without hesitation, without shame, without glancing to see who might be watching. The doctor nodded approvingly, jotting something down. But I saw the way my son's shoulders relaxed slightly after the words left his mouth, as though admitting it had freed him from a secret he had been clutching too tightly. After the doctor stepped out again, promising to return with instructions, the room quieted into a strange calm. My son looked at me with an expression I had not seen since he was a boy. Not guilt, not fear, something softer, something almost reverent. "I do not know how to do this," he whispered. "I do not know how to slow down. I do not know how to stop pretending I am fine. I do not know how to let anyone see me when I am afraid." His voice cracked on the last word, and something inside me cracked with it. He lowered his face into his hands, elbows resting on his knees, his body folding as if exhaustion were finally catching up to him after years of running on fumes. I reached out and placed my hand gently on his back. This time he did not flinch. He let the contact settle, let himself lean into it, let himself remember that he had once known how to be held, how to be vulnerable. He took a shaky breath and continued. I built this whole life trying to prove that I was better than where I came from. Better than the childhood we had. Better than the struggle. But the truth is, I am exhausted from pretending. I am tired of trying to look like someone I am not. I am tired of running so fast from my past that I forgot what it felt like to belong anywhere. My heart tightened painfully. I knelt beside him so he did not have to look down at me. I wanted him to see me eye to eye. I told him quietly that he did not need to prove anything. Not to his coworkers, not to society, not to the polished world he fought so hard to enter, not even to me. I reminded him that the strength of a person is not measured by how shiny their life looks, but by how honest their heart is. I reminded him that he came from resilience, from sacrifice, from survival. That none of that was shameful, that none of that diminished him. That the world he came from was full of grit and tenderness and love he had never needed to hide. He looked at me with wide eyes, as if those words reached a part of him that had been asleep for a very long time. His voice trembled when he asked something I had not expected. Do you think I can change? Not become someone different, become someone whole? I reached for his hand and held it between both of mine. I told him yes, not because he needed reassurance, but because he needed truth. He could change by remembering who he was before the world taught him that success required erasure. He could change by letting people see him without the armor. He could change by choosing connection over image. He could change by allowing himself to belong again without pretending. Tears filled his eyes, welling until they spilled softly down his cheeks. He didn't hide them. He didn't wipe them quickly. He let them fall, and I let them fall because those tears were not shame, they were recognition. They were the beginning of a bridge rebuilding itself plank by plank. A nurse came in then, asking him to move to a different room for monitoring. My son nodded weakly, and when he tried to stand, his legs faltered. I reached to steady him, and for a moment he let his full weight rest on me, trusting me openly, without fear of how it looked. He held onto my arm, gripping me tighter than he needed to, and whispered something that melted through every old hurt. Thank you for staying. I stayed silent because my voice would have cracked if I answered. We walked together down the hall, his steps small and shaky, my hand wrapped around his like it once had been when he was young and learning to walk for the first time. In the new room, he lay back against the pillows, exhaustion pulling at him like gravity. And then something happened that I had not expected. He reached for my hand again, not out of fear, not for support, but because he wanted to. Because he had remembered that I was not an embarrassment. I was home. While the nurse adjusted wires and machines, his coworkers walked past the doorway. They paused for a moment, their faces appearing in the small window. They saw him. And they saw me sitting beside him, holding his hand with my fingers intertwined in his. My son saw them too, but this time something remarkable happened. He did not let go. He didn't straighten. He didn't pretend. He didn't pull away from me. He kept holding my hand. And he lifted his chin slightly, as if declaring something silently but powerfully. This is my mother, not hidden, not diminished, not erased, acknowledged, and even though none of them said anything, I could feel the shift in him. A quiet reclaiming of the truth he had been afraid to embrace. A truth he had rediscovered not in triumph, but in vulnerability. He belonged to me, and I belonged to him, and no amount of polished ambition could rewrite that. When the coworkers walked away, he exhaled a long breath, his shoulders relaxing into the mattress, his hand still warm in mine. For the first time in years, he did not hide me. For the first time in years, he needed me. And for the first time in years, I saw the boy I once raised stepping slowly back into the man he wanted to become. The hours that followed unfolded slowly, like time itself had softened under the weight of everything my son had finally allowed himself to feel. The lights in the monitoring room dimmed into a gentler glow, shadows stretching quietly across the pale floor tiles as the late afternoon deepened toward evening. The machines beside him hummed steadily, their soft, rhythmic beeping forming a strange comfort, a steady heartbeat for a moment that felt fragile enough to break with the slightest pressure. I sat at his bedside, my hand resting lightly against his, neither of us speaking for a long while. His eyes drifted open and closed as exhaustion pulled at him, but each time he blinked awake, his gaze found mine, as if he was relearning how to look at me without fear of who might be watching. There was something profoundly tender in the quiet between us, a kind of healing that did not need words. My son had spent years trying to reshape himself into someone unrecognizable from the boy I raised, sanding away the softness, swallowing the vulnerability, tightening his posture until even his own heartbeat felt constrained. But here, beneath the muted hospital lights, that polished version of him had started to crumble, revealing the real man beneath. The one who still needed reassurance, who still sought safety, who still carried traces of the child who once buried his face in my shirt after bad dreams. He shifted slightly, wincing in discomfort, and I leaned forward to adjust the pillow behind him. He murmured a faint thank you, not out of obligation but out of genuine need, and something in the way he said it made my chest ache. It had been so long since he had looked at me with gentleness rather than distance. Too long since he had allowed himself to be small enough to need help. He pressed his hand against his side, trying to breathe through the faint tightness that returned in small pulses. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, the words forming slowly. "Do you think I became someone you can be proud of?" The question broke through the quiet like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the space between us. I stared at him, stunned not by the words themselves, but by the uncertainty reflected in his expression. Pride had always been a complicated shadow around him. He had chased achievement with such relentless hunger that he never paused long enough to ask why. And now here he was, lying in a hospital bed, stripped of everything except the truth he had tried so long to bury. I reached out and brushed the back of my fingers across his forehead, sweeping out of the way a strand of hair damp with sweat. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into the touch with an instinctive ease that nearly brought tears to my own. I told him softly that I had always been proud of him, not for his successes, but for the heart he had once carried so openly. The heart he had been afraid to show, as he stepped into rooms filled with people who judged worth by money and presentation, rather than character and resilience. I told him that the polished image he created did not make me proud. It was the vulnerability he was showing now. The courage to be human instead of perfect, the honesty he was finally letting himself express. He listened silently, then whispered something that made my breath tremble. "I forgot how to be your son." The truth of that sentence struck me so deeply that I felt the air shift inside my chest. He looked at his hands, turning them slightly as if expecting to see the boy he used to be written in the lines of his skin. He said that the more he climbed into a new life, the more he convinced himself that needing me was a sign he hadn't climbed high enough. He said he measured his worth by how far he could distance himself from the world that raised him. He said he wrapped his ambitions in armor so thick he forgot what it felt like to let anyone get close enough to see the bruises beneath it. I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away before he could see. I told him gently that he could never forget how to be my son, not truly. A mother carries her child in ways the world cannot measure, in ways no distance can dissolve. I told him that even when he hid from me, even when he pretended I was a stranger, even when he swallowed guilt instead of speaking truth, he was still mine. He always would be. He inhaled sharply, his eyes glistening as he looked at me with a vulnerability so raw it made him seem younger, softer, undone in the way only truth can undo a person. He whispered that he had spent so many years acting as if he didn't come from me. But now, in this room, facing the frailty of his own body, he felt closer to me than he ever had. I took his hand again, and this time he squeezed it, not hesitantly but with a kind of desperation, as though afraid I might disappear if he let go. I stayed still, letting the warmth of his hand settle into mine, letting him feel the steadiness of my presence, letting him know without words that I wasn't going anywhere. A nurse walked in to check his vitals, her voice gentle, her movements practiced and efficient. My son answered her questions with calm clarity, but he didn't release my hand, not even for a moment. When she left, he exhaled slowly, his body softening visibly. The evening light seeped into the room, painting the walls in faint shades of gold and peach. He turned his head toward the window and stared quietly for a long moment before speaking again. "I wish you could have seen the life I tried to build. Not because it was good, but because I tried so hard to make it look good. I wanted you to think I was doing better than I actually was. I wanted you to think I had everything under control. I wanted you to believe I had outgrown the mistakes I saw you make." His voice wavered, but the truth is I made worse ones. I lost myself in trying to outrun everything that shaped me, and I am tired, Mom. I am so tired. Hearing him say those words shattered something inside me. This was not the man who had walked into the hospital with a stiff spine and a polished facade. This was the boy I had raised. This was the child who used to cling to my skirt in crowded places, afraid of losing sight of me. This was the young teenager who sat with me in the dim kitchen with his hands shaking after his first heartbreak. This was the son who had been built from both my strength and my softness, and he had been drowning quietly, alone. I leaned closer and stroked his hair gently, the way I used to when he had fevers as a child. He closed his eyes and his breathing steadied, his face relaxing into something peaceful. I whispered that he didn't have to run anymore. I whispered that he didn't have to pretend. I whispered that no matter how far he had gone, no matter how much he had hidden, no matter how long he had tried to keep me out of his life, he still had me to return to. He opened his eyes slowly and looked up at me with an expression that made my heart swell painfully. Will you come with me to my next appointment? It was such a simple question, so simple, yet it carried the weight of reconciliation, of connection, of trust. It was his way of saying he wanted me in his life again, his way of saying he needed me, his way of saying he wanted to rebuild something he had shattered without fully realizing it. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment because my throat felt thick with emotion, and then his eyes softened again, shadows shifting gently beneath the surface. There is something else I need to tell you. My breath hitched. He turned his gaze toward the door, then back at me, his expression tight with something unspoken. I am not ashamed of you. I am ashamed of what I became when I left you behind. Before I could answer, the door swung open. And standing there was the last person either of us expected. His boss, the man whose approval he had spent years chasing, the man who represented the life he had been trying so desperately to fit into. And in that single moment, the truth of who my son now was collided head-on with the image he had tried so long to maintain. The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. The moment his boss stepped into the doorway, the air in the room tightened so sharply it felt like a string pulled taut enough to snap. He stood there in a pressed shirt and polished shoes, holding a folder under one arm, his posture crisp and confident in that effortless way people acquire when they've never had to question their place in the world. His gaze flicked from my son, lying in the hospital bed, to my hand, still resting gently against his, and then finally to my face. It was not cruel, nor dismissive, just curious in the way people look when they are trying to piece together a picture that does not match the one they had in their minds. My son stiffened. Not completely, not with the sharp jolt of panic he used to feel when he feared someone from work might see me beside him. This time the reaction was smaller, subtler, like a muscle memory he was fighting against. His fingers twitched slightly around mine, but he did not pull away. He didn't sit up straighter. He didn't adjust his tone. He didn't mask his vulnerability. He simply looked at his boss with tired eyes that carried the weight of the truth he had spent hours unraveling. His boss stepped farther into the room, pausing near the foot of the bed. His voice was controlled but softer than I expected, carrying a hint of real concern rather than professional obligation. He asked my son how he was feeling, mentioned that the office had tried calling when he didn't show up for an important meeting that morning. He said they were worried. His tone was professional, but there was something else beneath it, something human enough that it surprised me. My son cleared his throat, and for a moment I saw the instinctive urge inside him to minimize everything, to say he was fine, to push through, to pretend. It was the same instinct that had pushed him into exhaustion, into collapsing under the weight of his own ambition. But this time he stopped himself. He inhaled shakily and said the truth in a voice that cracked just slightly at the edges. I am not fine. His boss blinked, the honesty catching him off guard. My son continued before he could respond, his voice steadier now. I have been ignoring things, stress, pain, fatigue, and I pushed too far. His boss nodded slowly, absorbing the words with surprising patience. He set the folder down on the chair near the wall and pulled another closer. He sat down, elbows resting lightly on his knees, looking at my son with an expression that held no judgment, only curiosity mixed with a seriousness I had not expected. Why didn't you say anything sooner? My son's eyes flickered slightly in embarrassment. Because I did not want to seem weak. It was the kind of admission that peeled back every layer of the image he had built for himself, exposing the child beneath the child who had learned early that asking for help was dangerous, because help was never guaranteed. The child who had grown into a man who equated vulnerability with failure. His boss studied him for a moment, then exhaled softly. You are allowed to be human, you know. Everyone breaks at some point. My son's throat bobbed, and I could feel the tension in his hand loosen slightly. His boss glanced at me then, not with disdain but with recognition. And in that glance, I realized something startling. He hadn't known for certain who I was, but he had assumed something based on the closeness between us. He turned back to my son and asked gently, "Is this your mother?" My son did not hesitate this time. He did not glance at the door. He did not look down. He did not shift uncomfortably. He simply nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, this is my mother." The boss nodded respectfully and offered me a small, sincere greeting. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, not in judgment, but with the kind of awareness a person gains when they understand what sacrifice must have existed behind a man like my son. He didn't know our story, but in that small moment, he saw enough. Then he looked back at my son. She seemed worried when I walked in. My son's face softened in a way that made my heart tremble. He glanced at me, and for the first time in a very long time, there was no shame in the way he said the next words. "She is always worried about me. She always has been." Something in his boss's expression changed, not dramatically but noticeably. The respect became clearer, the understanding deeper. He leaned back slightly, his tone shifting from professional concern to something gentler. "You do not have to prove anything to anyone in the office, least of all me. If you need time, take it. If you need help, ask. No one is going to think less of you for it." My son's breath hitched, and he blinked several times as though fighting back a wave of emotion he wasn't used to letting rise. He nodded, his shoulders sagging as a burden he had carried for years finally loosened. His boss reached into the folder, pulled out a stack of documents, and placed them on the small table near the bed. "I brought these because the meeting can be postponed. Your health cannot." And then, almost as an afterthought, but in a tone that carried more weight than any polished encouragement, "Take care of yourself. And let someone take care of you." He glanced once more at me before standing to leave. When he reached the door, he paused, hand on the frame, and turned back with a faint, thoughtful expression. "And for what it is worth, you should not be ashamed of where you come from. None of us decide our beginnings, only what we do afterward." My son stared at him as if stunned by the unexpected kindness. And then his boss walked out, closing the door quietly behind him. The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was warm, soft, filled with a strange relief. My son let out a long, shaky breath, almost like a sob he managed to keep inside. Tears filled his eyes again, but this time they came with gratitude, not shame. He looked at me and whispered, "I have been so afraid of everything that did not matter." I brushed my thumb over the back of his hand, a gesture small but intimate enough to bridge years of distance. He continued in a trembling voice, "I thought I needed to be impressive. I thought I needed to rise so high that I could forget the hunger and cold and scraped knees. I thought success meant pretending none of it happened. Pretending you were not the reason I survived all of it. Pretending I could stand without remembering whose hands lifted me when I fell." His voice softened to almost nothing. "But all I did was lose myself." He blinked, a tear slipping quietly down his cheek. "And I almost lost you too." Those words struck me with an intensity I had not prepared for. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, devastating truth of it. He reached for me, his fingers trembling as if he feared I might move away. "Please do not leave." The child in him had resurfaced again, the one who needed reassurance, who needed a place to rest, who needed permission to not be strong every second of the day. I squeezed his hand gently and told him I was not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow. Not until he had found his way back to himself again. He leaned his head slightly to the side, resting just close enough to my hand that I could gently brush his hair from his forehead. The light from the window softened as the evening deepened, turning the room into a cocoon of shadows and gold. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly, deeply, like a man rediscovering the relief of being cared for. And then, after a long stretch of silence, he whispered a sentence that began to mend every fracture between us. "I want to come home with you when they discharge me." Home, the place he had spent years running from, the place he once saw as small and limiting, the place he believed he had outgrown. Now it was the place he wanted to heal in, the place where he felt safe again, the place where he remembered who he truly was. Before I could answer, the door opened again and the doctor returned with final instructions. But my son didn't pull his hand away this time. He held on to me, and I held on to him. For the first time in years, neither of us let go. The doctor's return felt like the quiet turning of a final page, the soft but decisive shift that signals the end of one chapter and the fragile beginning of another. He entered with a clipboard in hand, his expression calm and steady, the type of look practiced by someone who has walked families through uncertainty countless times. He explained the discharge protocol in a measured voice, detailing medication schedules, follow-up appointments, dietary changes, and stress management instructions. I listened closely, leaning forward slightly, absorbing each detail as though memorizing a map that would lead my son back from the edge he had unknowingly been balancing on for far too long. My son rested against the pillows, his face pale but softer than before, softened not by weakness, but by the release of burdens he had carried in silence for years. When the doctor finally concluded and asked if we had questions, my son hesitated for a moment before shaking his head gently. The doctor handed me the paperwork as naturally as if it were obvious that I would be the one to hold it. My son did not object. He did not tense. He did not try to pretend he was someone who didn't need help. He simply looked at me with the quiet acceptance of a man who had stopped running from the truth. After the doctor left, the room grew still again. The nurses dimmed the lights a final time in preparation for discharge. My son sat up carefully, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, breathing in shallow, controlled breaths. I stepped toward him, placing one hand lightly on his back, the same way I did when he was 10 years old and sick with a fever, trying to coax him into drinking water. He leaned into the touch without hesitation, closing his eyes briefly as though the weight of my hand steadied him more than the bed itself. He opened his eyes slowly, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. There was no polished veneer now, no mask. No performance, only honesty. Mom, he whispered, I do not know how to walk out of here and become the person I was pretending to be. I sat beside him on the narrow bed, taking his hand gently. I told him he did not have to become the person he had pretended to be. He only had to become the person he truly was, the one he had buried beneath layers of ambition, pride, and fear. I reminded him that he did not have to impress anyone to belong. He only had to allow himself to be seen. His throat tightened visibly, and he lowered his gaze as if those words pierced something inside him. I don't want to hide you anymore, he murmured softly. Not from my coworkers, not from anyone. I have spent so long being embarrassed of all the wrong things. I have been ashamed of the struggle instead of honoring it. I have been ashamed of needing you instead of being grateful you were still here for me. He paused, rubbing his thumb along the edge of the bedsheet as though grounding himself in the softness of the fabric. I almost lost everything today, and the first person I wanted near me was the mother I pretended not to need. His voice broke, not dramatically, quietly. The way men cry when they are exhausted from pretending to be strong. I took both of his hands in mine, feeling the faint tremble in them, the vulnerability he no longer tried to conceal. I told him he had not lost me. He never could. Even when he turned away, even when he shut me out, even when he hid me from the parts of his life he was proud of, he was still my son. The ache I carried had never been anger. It had been longing. A longing for him to remember where he came from. A longing for him to remember he was allowed to be human in front of me. He lifted his head then, meeting my eyes with a depth of emotion he had kept hidden behind every polished smile he had ever worn. For a moment, everything felt still. Not silent, but steady. The kind of steady that comes when something that was broken begins to mend. A nurse returned with a wheelchair, explaining that hospital protocol required patients to leave in one. My son hesitated for a breath, the old reflex of pride flickering across his expression. But then he exhaled and lowered himself into the chair, accepting its support without shame. I walked beside him as we moved through the hallways, past nurses and doctors, past families in various shades of worry, past the automatic doors that had witnessed the moment he whispered for me not to reveal who I was. But this time, when those doors opened, he didn't shrink from me. He didn't walk ahead. He didn't pretend. He reached for my hand and held it as he was wheeled into the cool evening air, the breeze brushing gently across his face. When we reached the curb where I had parked, he stood carefully, leaning against me just enough for me to feel his weight but not enough to burden me. I supported him with my arm around his back, the way I used to when he was learning to walk, guiding him with gentle patience. We reached the car, and he paused before getting in. The sky above us was painted with streaks of fading light, the world washed in that quiet glow that comes just before dusk fully settles. He turned to me, his expression soft and unguarded. "I want to stay with you tonight." The words came without hesitation, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of a desire to reconnect with something he had lost. A desire to be in a place where he didn't have to pretend. A desire to rest in the familiarity of the woman who had once been his entire world. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment as emotion pressed against my throat. I unlocked the car, helped him settle into the seat, and closed the door gently, the click of it sounding like a promise of renewal. As I walked around to the driver's side, I felt something shift inside me. Not the ache of being hidden, not the sting of being an embarrassment. Something new, something hopeful. He trusted me again. He allowed himself to need me again. He remembered I was his mother. The drive home was quiet, but not tense. He looked out the window with a reflective expression, as though watching the city pass was allowing him to see his life with new clarity. When we reached my home, he stepped inside slowly, taking in the familiar scent, the worn furniture, the quiet stillness. He didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't scan the room with judgment. Instead, he walked to the small picture frames on the shelf and traced his finger across one of them gently. "I forgot how much this place feels like peace," he whispered. I asked him if he was hungry, and for the first time in years, he nodded without insisting that he was. I warmed soup, the same recipe I used when he was a child, the aroma filling the small kitchen as he sat at the table, watching me move with a softness in his eyes that nearly broke me. When I set the bowl in front of him, he smiled faintly, a real smile, not the polished one he wore for coworkers. He took a spoonful, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I missed this, I missed you." And with those words, the years of distance, the wounds of shame, the heaviness of pretending, all of it softened, not erased, but softened enough to make room for something new, something fragile and precious. Connection. He stayed the night in the old room he grew up in. Before he closed the door to rest, he paused and looked at me with a tenderness I had not seen since he was a little boy. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. Thank you for not letting me go." I touched his cheek lightly, brushing away a tear he didn't try to hide. "I will always be here," I whispered. "Even when you forget me, even when you hide me, even when you think you no longer need me." He held my gaze for a long moment. I remember now. When he closed the door, I stood there for a few seconds, letting the quiet settle around me. The house felt different somehow, not because anything had changed in its walls, but because something had shifted inside the person who slept within them. My son was not the polished man who had walked into that hospital telling me to disappear. He was the boy I raised, the man he wanted to become, the human he had forgotten he was allowed to be. And in the stillness of that night, I realized something profound. Sometimes it takes breaking for someone to remember where they belong. And sometimes it takes a single question from a doctor to bring a son back to the mother he once tried to leave behind. If this story touched you, follow the channel for more powerful, raw, heart-shaking stories every week. I write about family, sacrifice, betrayal, healing, motherhood, and the moments that change everything. Follow now so you never miss the next story that breaks your heart and puts it back together. Like, share, and comment to support the channel and help these emotional stories reach more people. Turn on notifications so you're always first to read what comes next. Your support keeps these stories alive. Stay with the channel, more unforgettable stories are on the way.